Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
My name's Paul. We may have met. If not, I don't know if I've really sort of formally addressed the room. My name's Paul, one of the program leads of the Psychedelics and Spirituality program for the Center for the Study of World Religions. I get the great honor of giving myself all my favorite jobs during the conference. And when we put this panel together, I was like, I am going to be moderating this one. I'm very excited to do it. My clipboard here. All right, what is happening? All right. This is the Psychedelic Shadows, Reevaluating the Renaissance. I think it's a scarier panel name than maybe it needs to be. But a dose of fear, never hurt anybody. I'm Paul, yes, okay. Let's see here. Oh, yes, we're in a Renaissance, been often declared. We've been talking about our good friend Michael Pollan all day. Some say this book began the Renaissance. Some say it began in the 2000s with the return of Psilocybin research at Johns Hopkins. But there were also calls of a Renaissance in the 1990s, that a psychedelic Renaissance had begun then. And what do you know? There's also calls of perhaps we were in a psychedelic Renaissance in the 1980s. So, what is a psychedelic Renaissance? Maybe we'll decide in 2 hours. We can figure out if we were ever in one or if we're in something else entirely. So we have 4 presentations here. I'm going to introduce each speaker before they speak. We'll hold questions to the end. We'll get a sort of panel discussion and discussion in the room going. If you're looking for the psychedelic church leaders, I don't think, they may be, but the panel dedicated to such things is the other room if you're looking for that. So without further ado, let's introduce Marlena Robbins, who's a member of the Dene Nation, and she's a Doctor of Public Health candidate at UC Berkeley. Please give her a warm welcome.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. She'e Marlena Robbins inisha ya idina etati inishle todachini bashichin todakojidashite bahanda. My name is Marlena Robbins, and I am a 4th-year Doctor of Public Health candidate at UC Berkeley. And today I'm going to be presenting some findings from the first paper of my dissertation research, Multi-Generational Perspectives of Psilocybin Mushrooms in Urban Native Communities. Where are we going here? There we go. So this is my dad. My sisters, and me. Grew up in Window Rock, Arizona on the Navajo Reservation. My father grew up in Fort Defiance, Arizona. And in 2021, he was diagnosed with stage 4 liver and gallbladder cancer. And at the time when he was diagnosed, I was actually reading Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind and learning about psilocybin-assisted therapy for end-of-life cancer patients experiencing anxiety. And I talked to him about it. We didn't do it, but it was the fact that he had it as an option that many of his siblings didn't have. And many of his siblings who were exposed to uranium mining radiation on the Navajo Reservation didn't have access to this treatment. And so that's what led me here. That's what led me to public health. I'm a firm believer that my research informs my family and my family informs my research. I'm very much my positionality as a researcher. I have an obligation to my clanship systems. I have an obligation to the people that I come from and to my family. And this is who I do my research for. So I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for being open to all of us and our stories that we have to share today. So between 2022 and 2024, I conducted 30 semi-structured interviews with self-identifying urban Native adults in 17 cities across 19 states. And the guiding framework is collective continuance. which is an Anishinaabe concept introduced to academia by Dr. Kyle White. And it describes how communities carry knowledge across time in order to sustain life, to build intergenerational relationships, and to maintain responsibility for human and more than human worlds. And it focuses on maintaining the conditions that allow communities, ecosystems, and knowledge systems to continue together over time. And so this is a figure that shows the spectrum of psilocybin use among participants. And as you can see at the top, it goes from ceremonial to recreational to conservative to abstinence, showing that the positions are dynamic. The participants move across the spectrum over the life course, and generational tendencies reflect emergent patterns. They're not universal cohort characteristics. So for example, the baby boomers appear across multiple positions, reflecting the greatest within cohort variation in the sample. So let's get into our baby boomers. And I do this work because of my own family and thinking about my parents and their generation. I have two older sisters, they're 8 and 9 years older than me. So they're Gen X, they're a different generation, and I'm a millennial. And so that's how I've been kind of positioning this spectrum and kind of understanding how they grew up learning about psychedelics. How did their parents talk about it? How were they exposed to it? How did they engage with it? How did my sisters engage with it? And so that's where this spectrum of use kind of came from, and really wanting to hear those stories and those perspectives. And always asking people, have you ever done psychedelics? What was that like? Where were you? Who were you with? And so I'm very grateful for the participants and the stories that they shared with me. I've been trusted with this knowledge, and I want to do my best to do their stories justice, to carry them respectfully and with honor. And so this cohort sits at this fracture point in the intergenerational transmission chain. They're the children of boarding school survivors. So they inherited the silence that federal assimilation policy produced. And when they encountered psilocybin, every single participant arrived through a distinct and unrelated pathway, which was without elder guidance or ceremonial context. So for one participant, she was a 67-year-old woman living in Phoenix, was at a family gathering in her mid-20s, and where they had already been drinking, and somebody came and they were passing around mushrooms. And she was surprised because when she took them, she said that they made her calm. And she compared it to alcohol. She said, with alcohol, I'd be acting all stupid. Somebody would be yelling at me. I'd get chased to bed, pass out, wake up with a hangover. But with these, I was able to experience it, feel the calmness, be able to do stuff. And she was explicit about why she was so open to experimenting with these different substances. She said, the trauma that I was having at home, I didn't want to deal with it. And it made me feel calm. And so this is a young Native woman at that time using psilocybin as self-medication because there was no cultural or clinical or ceremonial support system to support what she was carrying as a youth. Another participant came through commerce, and as a teenager, he entered the drug economy of the Rainbow family in the 1970s counterculture movement that used indigenous spiritual language to frame its psychedelic trade. And he sent me images of the original packaging from that era. So it reads Rainbow Light Healing Nectar from Sacramental and Healing Usage Only. And with an accompanying insert that compresses Aztec, Mazatec, and Hopi references into marketing copy. So the pattern we observe today in the clinical psychedelic renaissance, where indigenous knowledge is extracted and repackaged without indigenous governance, has a direct material precedent in the lived experiences of this cohort. These encounters occurred entirely outside of ceremonial structure and often produced harm. The same participant described consuming far too much because no one understood dosing. And he said, we went to places that literally sometimes it was good, but most of the time it was just scary. There was nobody there to pull us back. We would enter this realm and we were there, we couldn't get out. And he talked about entering into realms where there were entities that they were like, you're not supposed to be here. What are you doing here? And so he stopped using mushrooms entirely. And then at age 40, he said he walked into peyote ceremony and, in his own words, a dying drunk, and walked out sober, never touching alcohol again. So one participant offered something that really spoke to me. He said, what his father always told him. He said, you don't get ahead of the medicine. You let the medicine take you where you need to go. Don't get ahead of it and it'll find you. It will find you and it will take you and it will put you where you need to be. And then he paused and he said, I'm sure that whoever you're interviewing, all these people are the exact right people to give you the information, because through the medicine, we've all been connected. Gen X. They described active prohibition enforced through fear, federal drug policy, and household punishment. The structural outcomes was the same, which was a complete absence of cultural transmission. And one participant said it directly, I didn't get a lot of guidance or insights from any family members on these kinds of things, which in hindsight, I'm just like, man, if I just had someone, anybody to be like, here's the right way to do it. I was just on my own mostly. The conditions under which Gen X encountered psilocybin were markedly more violent. And one participant was homeless at 12. She was living in a group home for runaway kids when she first ate mushrooms. She said, when I was in a gang or on the street, it would help us battle the elements from being outside, from having to live outside. Somebody would have a bag of mushrooms and we'd all just take a little bit, a handful, and we'd be outside all night laughing and running around. It didn't seem so bad or cold or rainy or whatever was going on out there at the time. And so this is a 12-year-old girl using psilocybin to survive because the system had ultimately failed her. Other participants talked about sitting with their entire family. So I've sat with my daughters and all my son-in-laws. We've been healing as a family. It's been beautiful. One participant talked about going to Colombia and sitting with ayahuasca. And she said that the medicine was telling her that she had a wound on her maternal side, and the medicine kept pointing to the womb. And she went back home and she told her mom this story. And she said, Mom, the medicine told me that at 6 months, her mom had a miscarriage, and she was left alone in the maternity ward for 3 days while she was listening to the babies cry, and that grief never got dealt with. And so that created a disconnection from her body and a disconnection from her children. And so when she told her mom that story, her mom left and she went to feed her horses. And when she came back and she said, yes, she said, all those parts are true. And so Gen X is carrying a lot. They're doing a lot. They're doing a lot of healing. And they're also carrying the sharpest structural critique of any cohort. So one participant named it, and they said, what I see in the psychedelic resurgence is the same values that animate everything else: materialism, domination, capitalism, profit for shareholders over everything else. It's highly unrelational culture. Another offered the most direct statement on sovereignty in the entire data set. They said, Native voices must be taking the lead. We are a moral compass for this country. And if you don't maintain that tradition and the promises and the visions our elders had for us, then we can get lost in this academic capitalistic system. So for the millennials, there's a story that I want you to hear, and it's a woman whose parents were a part of the American Indian movement. She shared that at age 23, she lost her son, and she fell into a depression so severe, she was actively planning to end her life. And she was in a physically abusive relationship using cocaine and alcohol. And a friend suggested mushrooms. And she took her psilocybin with her siblings on a blanket on the floor. And she said, I felt this immense warmth take over my body that I had not felt since before I lost my son. And it was the first time in probably a year that I had actually felt love or comfort and not blaming myself for what had happened when I lost my child. She paused and said, I was suicidal and I was actively in a self-destructive relationship. And from that point on, instead of being super self-destructive, it got in my mind that it was possible to feel better. It took me outside of my own mind and grief. And she began pairing psilocybin with prayer and running. And she stopped using cocaine. She stopped drinking because the psilocybin made other substances unnecessary. Another participant who's indigenous from Panama was adopted into a white family in Oklahoma and spent years cycling through the prison system with alcoholism and methamphetamine. And he was released from inpatient treatment in 2020, and he was preparing to go back out and drink again. And a friend came and he gifted him 10 grams of mushrooms. And he said that night, alone in his backyard, he ate the entire bag. And the next day, he was great. And the next day, he didn't want to drink. The next day, he said, I woke up, I didn't want a cigarette. There wasn't anything in my mind telling me to stop drinking. I just completely stopped. And something literally stuck a cog into that and reversed it completely, 100% without me even knowing it. And now, today, he has been sober. He runs a community organization doing microdosing classes and harm reduction education. He works on peyote conservation work in Oklahoma tribes. He's teaching his son how to grow mushrooms, and his adoptive parents, now in their late 70s, who wouldn't let him even smoke legal cannabis in the backyard, are asking him about microdosing. So Gen Z. Gen Z grew up in a digital landscape where information about psilocybin was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. And it was on everyone. It was everywhere on social media, on TikTok, in mainstream wellness culture. It was nowhere in their families, in their communities, in their cultural teachings. And the defining characteristics of this generation is that they went looking. So one participant who's a Nawa two-spirit in their early 20s grew up in a conservative religious household where traditional medicines were suppressed by the church. And during the pandemic, they began researching Xochipilli, the Nawa deity known as the Prince of Flowers associated with beauty, two-spirit identity in plant medicines. The colonial suppression of indigenous sexuality and the colonial suppression of indigenous plant medicines were, for this participant, the same project. They were covered both through the same act of research. They said in Nawa, we call them teo nanakat. Nanat means meat, any kind of flesh, and the teo part comes from teot, which means God or gods. So teo nanakat means flesh of the gods, because when you partake in them, we believe that's how you communicate with the gods, and that's how you reach their realm. And they traveled to Oaxaca and sat in ceremony with the maestra from one of the 3 original families who practiced traditional mushroom medicine in Hualta de Jimenez, the same town where Maria Sabina lived. A second participant's grandfather spoke openly about psilocybin as a substance with religious significance that carried healing properties, but because of family rupture and the criminalization rhetoric in their household, the mother refused to openly talk about it. And so he's having to use academic research to really validate what his grandfather was teaching him at the age of 10. Thank you. The third participant is a native graduate student at Berkeley, and he grew up in a village where no one discussed mushrooms. He said he tried psilocybin in the Berkeley Hills, and his assessment was, this isn't a big deal. And if any drug should be focused on, it should be alcohol, because alcohol is high risk of abuse and no therapeutic value. And he recalled a story from his community about medicine people collecting urine from caribou that had eaten psychoactive mushrooms to communicate with spirits, a practice documented in the ethnographic literature on circumpolar indigenous peoples going back to the 18th century. And he paused and said, which I guess means that we should have more stories if that's a thing that can happen up north with caribou. And I need to ask him about this. So he's actively thinking during the interview, he was recognizing that his own nation may hold knowledge about psychoactive fungi that colonial suppression had rendered invisible, and that those questions just haven't been asked yet. So the 5 cross-cutting themes that came from this, that emerged from all 4 cohorts, is colonial suppression and transmitted prohibition, unguided encounter in the absence of cultural container, crisis as catalyst, making the turning point from substance to medication, extraction, commercialization, and sovereignty, and reclamation and intergenerational responsibility. So together, these themes, they trace a collective arc from colonial prohibition through unguided encounter to deliberate healing, and ultimately to cultural reclamation. And this is what Dr. Kyle White theorizes as collective continuance, which is the capacity of Indigenous peoples to sustain intergenerational systems of knowledge, governance, and relationality in the face of ongoing disruption. One of the implications from this work that I've come across is the clinical frameworks need to integrate culture, developing a culturally informed psychedelic assisted therapy model where participants feel reflected, where they hear their mother tongue, they smell their medicines, they feel the energy of their medicine people in the same room as a therapist who's taking their blood pressure, who's checking on them, who's talking them through it. An example of this is Roots to Thrive in Canada, where Indigenous communities, First Nations communities sat with ketamine, and they were able to bring in the medicine people who sang their songs, said their prayers in their language, had their food, their Indigenous foods ready, but they also worked with the therapists, they worked with the doctors. And so what this looks like is two-eyed seeing approach, and really the braiding of these systems where both have power, both have equilibrium of knowledge that can teach one another and learn from each other. Thinking about pricing structures. So for example, $1,000 to $3,000 per session structurally excludes the highest burden per populations. There's governance failure, requires structural remedy, more than 1,000 patents filed with zero reciprocal agreements with any Indigenous community, and investment in Indigenous-led cultural infrastructure that includes language revitalization, intergenerational mentorship, and community-controlled ceremonial spaces, which are public health investments. So I will end there. This was one of my quotes. So you don't get ahead of the medicine. You let the medicine take you where you need to go. It will find you and it will put you where you need to be, and it connects you with the right people together too. And I've very much experienced this when I do microdose. I don't know if anyone's seen Harry Potter, but he takes the liquid luck and he just gets put into every scenario that he's supposed to be in. And every time I've been able to take the medicine, I trust that the medicine is going to take me where I need to be, and brought me to Harvard. So thank you.
Dr. J. Christian Greer. Let me see if I can just do his bio off the top of my head because I left my clipboard there. He's a full-time lecturer at Stanford University's School of Medicine in the Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Department, among a number of other things. Pilgrim. You want to present from there or from here? Yeah. Okay, cool. We are. We are.
Thanks, Paul. Wow, what a fantastic conference so far. Thanks to the last presenter as well. That was really, really impactful. Just a short note, I know I'm eating into my time, but there might be something to this psychedelic thing, because when I look out in the audience, there's so many smiles and like bright eyes. I presented a lot of conferences. You never see smiles. I don't know. Who knows? All right, so much of this talk is drawn from my new book, which will be out in September, called Crimes Against Normality. And it's a history of psychedelicist networks in the 1980s. But let's get into this. All right. This paper is intended as an intervention into the historiography of psychedelics in the post-war era. Specifically, it's an intervention into what I term the master narrative. You know the story. I'm loath to tell it, and I assume you have no interest in hearing it again. This is the never-endingly told story, to borrow a phrase, that runs from the synthesis of LSD by Sandoz chemist Albert Hofmann, 1F, in 1938, and apparently rediscovered in 1943. Goes from here to the publication of Doors of Perception by Al Huxley in 54, which was then programmatized right underneath our feet here at Harvard by Tim Leary, Richard Alpert, later Ram Dass, Huxley, Watts, and friends. From there, entangled controversies at Harvard. The story moves to the left coast, San Francisco, California, where it climaxes apparently in 1969 at the Woodstock Festival, et cetera, et cetera. The never-endingly told story ends magically in the late 60s and early 70s when everyone who took LSD turned into a pumpkin. This narrative might have served the purpose at one point, but now it obscures more than it reveals. I think it's time to move beyond this tale to tell new stories. However, my aim today is not simply expanding the archive with new stories. No, I'm here for something more ambitious. I want to introduce new conceptual frameworks that explain why we have to deal with a never-endingly told story, illuminate the stakes involved in dismantling the never-endingly told story, and open up new cognitive spaces where heterogeneous variety of voices can be heard. These frameworks ascribe new meanings and values onto psychedelic experiences, a task with which we in the humanities are specifically trained to do, as my friend Ramsey says. It is the part we were born to play, so let's start playing it. Let me show you what I mean. The year is 1984, and the empire has definitely struck back. The Reagan imperium is in full swing and would last for the duration of Ronald Reagan's first and second term in office as president of the US, 1981 to 1989. This is the era of the conservative right and the ascendancy of the moral majority. Under Reagan, Americans were becoming more wealthy, patriotic, and reactionary. Perhaps none more so than the First Lady of the US, Baroness Nancy Reagan, who coined the drug war slogan, "Just say no." The First Lady was an absolutist in her moral prejudice against mind expanders and the people who use them. In her words, quote, "This is a war, and anyone who even suggests a tolerant attitude towards drug use should be considered a traitor." This is important language that I'm going to return to. It is said that stars shine the brightest in the darkest skies, and this is certainly the case here. As it is within this repressive climate that we find an efflorescence of psychedelicist networks that were bigger, bolder, and more diverse than anything that unfolded in the 60s. The 80s were home to the original psychedelic renaissance, which has gone almost totally unexplored by historians. What went into this renaissance? Well, as you'll see, the psychedelicist landscape of today owes more to it, the 1980s, than any previous decade. Said differently, we're still living in the 80s. Let me give you a few representative examples of how today's psychedelicist culture is the product of forgotten decades. By the 1980s, the Grateful Dead had grown into a cultural phenomenon, and it was during this decade that their influence took hold in popular culture. Their tunes, iconography, and drug habits filtered into elite boarding schools, college campuses, and not long thereafter, the Dead jumped from dorm rooms to boardrooms, becoming a touchstone for corporate management literature up to the present day. You'll see that on the bottom left. Also, the Dead's only top 10 Billboard hit, Touch of Grey, came out in 87. Anyways, here's another example. The industrial synthesis and mass distribution of LSD also reignited in the 1980s. According to one source, the acid boom of the 80s was linked to the release of a number of high-profile LSD chemists like Nick Sands from prison. Even a single example is representative here. The 1988 arrest of William Leonard Picard netted the DEA 90,000 tabs of acid and over 120 capsules. At the time, he was probably one of 7 LSD manufacturers working on that scale. This was also the era of Parliament Funkadelic. It's the time when the Funketeers developed beyond the band into a full-blown Afrocentric subculture of Black psychedelicism, which has only gained steam as Afrofuturism. Oh yeah, the first Burning Man, 1986. I won't waste more of your time by going over this laundry list, but let's just say psychedelicism's most eloquent bard, Terence McKenna, took off in the early 80s with his extraterrestrial origins of psilocybin theory, the psychedelic origins of the human species, the stoned ape hypothesis. Oh yeah, remember this? Time wave zero? You probably know it as something else, the 2012 prophecy ascribed to ancient Mayans. Yeah, that was Terry. Oh yeah, finally, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, founded in 1986. There's many more examples I go into my present book, but it all begs the question, why are scholars still rehearsing the master narrative of the 1960s? Especially considering how formative the 80s were. And I assume the 90s were just as important. How do we account for this erasure in our historical memory? And most importantly, who cares? Well, the who cares is exactly what interests me. And it is on this platform, Who Cares, that I will introduce the framework. All right, the rest of this presentation is broken into two parts. Number one, I'm going to identify and dismantle the conceptual structures and tropes that fix the master narrative in place. I coined the term drug fog of war as a means of naming this sorry situation. The second section lays out a new framework that underscores diversification and heterogeneity, which have characterized the cultures of mind expansion for the last 60 years. I call this framework psychedelicism. All right. I have spent a lot of time thinking about why there is significantly less scholarship on the diversification of psychedelicist networks over the last half century. My conclusion is that we have failed collectively to truly conceptualize just how dramatically the war on drugs warped our perception. The war on drugs did far more than criminalize substances and users. It reshaped the conditions under which knowledge about psychedelics could be produced in the first place. For decades, serious, value-neutral scholarship was tacitly discouraged, while popular and academic discourses alike defaulted to campaigns of silence, pathologizing drug use, and sheer moral panic. I refer to this regime of distortion as the drug war fog. This fog is a conceptual space that obscured not only psychedelic practices, but denied the value-neutral approaches we need to study them. Fostering a culture of intolerance, the logic of the drug war flatly rejected the fact that is absolutely basic, that psychedelic experiences remain a meaningful dimension of the human story across time and across space. My concept of the drug war fog, of course, is a play on the fog of war, as conceptualized by the Prussian military strategist Karl von Clausewitz in his seminal book On War from 1800. The original phrase describes the chaos and confusion that overtakes the battlefield once combat has initiated. Likewise, the drug war fog names the miasma of disinformation and misinformation that followed the inauguration of the war on drugs in 1971 and President Richard Nixon's declaration that drugs were, quote, public enemy number one. The drug war fog only thickens when we bear in mind that the situation was not just about top-down institutional suppression, but also included bottom-up clandestinity. For the last half decade, psychedelicists were persecuted and therefore first forced to cover their tracks, use false names, employ a galaxy of code words, disguise their beliefs, and burn their records, lest they suffer the punitive reprisals of drug war enforcers. Here's the bottom line. We're never going to get the full story of the psychedelicist networks of the post-war era. Forget about it. Too many government files were destroyed. Too many secrets were taken to the grave. Too many scholarly books were left unwritten. That said, it is possible for scholars to navigate their way out of this miasmic fog so as to establish a post-drug war historiography. And I think the first step entails dismantling the conceptual frameworks that mislead research. What is the fog? Well, here are a few components. The repressive atmosphere of the drug war crystallized into a set of concepts and interpretive frameworks that continue to structure our thinking today. One significant example is the declensionist narrative, which has been promoted by conservative and progressive historians alike. This narrative of declension, treated the upwelling of psychedelic enthusiasm and experimentation in the 50s and 60s as a social pathology that collapsed under the weight of its own naivete in the 1970s. At the core of this idea is a familiar yet superficial trope that in the end, it was all Tim Leary's fault. This frustratingly simple trope, the claim that it's all Leary's fault, is a bogus fait accompli. As though the downfall of psychedelicist research in the academy and psychedelicist culture on the street and the rise of the drug war can be traced back to the antics of some storefront messiah. No, we must recognize this cultural shift, the drug war fog, as a coordinated campaign of violence carried out at every level of the US government against its own citizens. The repressive cultural atmosphere created by this perspective has restricted the intellectual space to discuss an obvious fact. We all know it, but don't say it. Americans of every race, creed, age, class, gender, and ethnicity love to get high and have done so across time and space. All right, while the declensionist narrative has misshaped historical memory, its deleterious effects on scholarship pale in comparison to a much more pervasive artifact of the drug war, the concept of counterculture. If you've heard me talk in the last few years, you know what I'm going to say, so I'll just keep it brief. It's hard to overemphasize the incoherence of this idea, as it indiscriminately homogenizes diverse political, spiritual, and artistic institutions. I mean, come on, was there one counterculture and did it start in the 60s? Or does every culture have a counterculture? Moreover, it wrongly paints all of the eclectic elements it encompasses as universally oppositional, counter to culture. I mean, really, are defiance and opposition the primary features of ecofeminism, surfer dudism, Afrofuturism, or queer rave scenes? Hardly. If anything, these currents are defined by creativity, exploration, togetherness, merriment, cultural innovation, oh yeah, and fun. Like the declensionist narrative, counterculture is just another artifact of the drug war that we need to retire. All right, against the fog. Now that we're in the concluding section, let me state outright that my aim here is not purely deconstructive. I'd like to take a more creative approach. My critical reflections are grounded in an alternative framework, which I call psychedelicism. Not unlike other isms, psychedelicism suggests an assortment of identities with their own distinct historical roots, legacies, institutions, and ideological descendants. This framing emphasizes how mind expanders inspired a multi-layer network of traditions with long histories of heterogeneity, internal antagonisms, and cross-pollination. I mean, there's as many forms of psychedelicism as there are psychedelicists, it seems, ranging from the fascist millenarianism of Charles Manson's Helter Skelter to the self-optimization strategies behind the corporate culture of microdosing to the libidinal utopianism of Mark Fisher's acid communism. And it's not just an exclusive identity. There are Black psychedelicisms, just as there is the acid chicanismo of lawyer-cum-author Oscar Zeta Acosta, and the Asian American psychedelicism of Maxine Hong Kingston's novel, Tripmaster Monkey, and her other novel, Chinamen. Although different psychedelicist traditions unfold in divergent ways, sometimes antagonistic ways, they nevertheless share a common intellectual commitment as first introduced in Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception. What is this commitment? That psychedelic drugs augment consciousness by, quote, expanding the mind to perceive deeper dimensions of reality. By extension, the concept of psychedelicism underscores how there are many alternative systems of meanings and values projected onto powerful psychotropics. What are some of these different projections? For example, ayahuasca use in pre-colonial Peru or hashish use amongst medieval Sufis do not fall under the auspice of psychedelicism. It's the wrong word. Psychedelicism is a modern Western interpretation of what happens when the body metabolizes these substances. Finally, psychedelicism does not signify mere drug taking. It is not just another way to describe someone who trips all the time. The term for that is psychonaut. The psychedelicist translates their cosmic visions into everyday realities. Their lives may not revolve around drugs. Rather, their identities and practices are informed by their noetic experiences, occasioned by mind expanders. Think of the Coquettes, the transgender fuck theater group. Think of Tescrial, that bundle of ideologies that includes transhumanism, extropianism, etc., etc. Think of ravers or burners, the so-called earth freaks, new age travelers, the early deep ecologists, cyberdelic mutants, etc. Psychedelicism, we have to admit, is anchored in the dissolution of boundaries, the dissolution of binaries. Mind-body dissolved, sacred profane dissolved, real unreal, time-space, subject-object, dissolution. Psychedelicism encompasses folklore, recipes, ideals and vendettas, tripping protocols, poetry, initiatic genealogies, styles of humor, aesthetics, secrets, micro-histories, macro-histories, institutions, and received wisdom. It offers imagined pasts and futures yet to be. Think of psychedelicism like, I don't know, modernism or romanticism. It's not one ideology. Rather, it's a field of expression defined by recurring logics and sensibilities. Psychedelicism is a mentality. Here, I would just like to shout out my friend, Susan Stryker, and her intervention in post-transsexual theorizing. It is from her work that I will now draw this conclusion to an end by reiterating the stakes involved in this intervention. A post-drug war historiography shifts attention away from drugs and towards psychedelicist people. Why? The drug war was anchored in an obsessive focus on drugs. It proclaimed itself to be a war on illicit substances. But this is a total misdirection, pure fog. The drug war was a war against individuals. It was a war against communities, particularly people of color. The drug war was a workaround for criminalizing, brutalizing, and dehumanizing specific people. Nixon's infamous domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, even admitted as such. In his words, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war, Vietnam War, or Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. Shocking, a shocking admission. The point of this intervention is to move away from the misleading preoccupation with drugs. I'm not interested in drugs as a historian of psychedelics. I'm interested in psychedelic people, psychedelicist communities, and psychedelicist networks. Moreover, there is no monolithic conception of psychedelic experience. It simply doesn't exist. There are only psychedelic experiences, and those experiences are held by people with very real backgrounds and very real histories and very real stories that have been excluded from legitimate inquiry until just recently. A post-drug war historiography returns moral agency to the people whose subjectivity has been erased in this era of prohibition and persecution. In sum, it's by virtue of recognizing the multiplicity and heterogeneity of these experiences that we can start to build new therapeutic models, medical models, and historiographic models that are responsible to the ecstatic modalities of higher consciousness. In sum, clearing the drug fog of war is therefore not simply a corrective to the past. No, it's a methodological precondition for understanding humanity's history with altered states. Recognizing them as recurrent and consequential forces in human history rather than mere anomalies lost in the fog. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. That was super. I'm having a blast. I don't know about you guys. Oh, also, we are filling up. So if you all could, this is not a political suggestion, move to the center to make room on the outside for folks who are coming in late. Next up, we have Annalisa Butici and Osiris Garcia Cerqueda. Dr. Butici is a professor of anthropology and religious studies at Georgetown. And Dr. Garcia Cerqueta is a Mazatec historian and sociologist. He's an affiliated researcher at Georgetown and the program coordinator of Chacruna's Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative. Please welcome my friends here. You don't have to.
Niños santos, somos la voz que emerge de lo profundo, la que se entrelaza con la raíz del árbol sagrado. Somos los pequeños que brotan de la madre tierra, los tiernos, pequeños niños santos. Los antiguos abuelos nos respetaban y nos cuidaban con gran delicadeza. Nuestra abuela nos mostró el camino con velas y copal trazó el horizonte. Aquella que con su fuerza danzaba con la lluvia, el río y el viento. Ricas eran sus ofrendas perfumadas del dulce néctar de las reinas. Mas ahora los hijos me han deshonrado. Ya no nos protegen ni tampoco nos alimentan. Se burlan, nos ensucian y pisotean. Porque ahora intercambian el oro por acero. Aquí estamos, aquí seguimos, mientras el tiempo lo permita. Solo cuiden del bosque, que de ahí proviene la vida. Hello everyone. Osiris Garcia, Mina. Hello everyone, my name is Osiris Garcia Cerqueda, member of the Mazatec people. I honor the sacred mushrooms, the Mazatec guardians and my ancestral tradition. My deepest gratitude to the Harvard Divinity School for welcoming this lecture and to create its dialogue space. We come as researchers and as individuals committed to serving the ancestral Mazatec tradition, offering our work to reveal the challenges it now faces. We always visited the sacred sites of the Mazatec people. The last year, we ascended a sacred Mazatec mountain. The spiritual guardians saw us and hear us, and now we are here. We come from faraway places, geographically and historically. This presentation, part of ongoing research, brings together diverse knowledge to reveal the Mazatec territory as a living complexity, social, biocultural, ecological, and spiritual. This morning, I had the opportunity to see some images of the Gordon Wasson file. I identified places where my grandpas lived, where my father walked in his childhood, places where I walked too. You, the Western people, asking for psychedelic justice. We, the Mazatecs and indigenous peoples, need historical justice. Mushrooms and sacred nature deserve respect.
Quédate. Quédate acá. In Huautla de Jimenez in the Sierra Mazateca, sacred mushrooms known as the Niños Santos, the Holy Children, are openly sold in psychedelic tourist market. But at the same time, the curanderos, the healers, lament that these beings, the mushrooms, are becoming increasingly difficult to find for the veladas, the healing ceremonies. Collectors recall that not long ago, the Niños Santos would populate entire fields, growing abundantly across the Sierra and even close to people's home. But today, one must walk for hours to find them. During our fieldwork, we repeatedly witnessed vendors offering Niños Santos preserved in honey or wrapped in paper for sale for foreigners, including myself. We also introduced collectors, curandero healers, and community elder who shared memories from the 60s when young tourists wandered the street of Huautla, consuming mushrooms openly on the Cerro de la Adoración or alone in the rooms, often with deeply distressing results. These encounters crystallized the tension between commercial psychedelic circuits and sacred use. But how are the Niños Santos themselves reacting to this? This is not a rhetorical question. In the Sierra Mazateca, the Niños Santos are understood as sentient, sacred, herb beings, person with agency, or I would say niños with agency, whose responses to climate-driven land transformation and extractive global psychedelic markets are themselves meaningful and consequential. So today we present preliminary funding from our multi-species ethnographic project launched in 2025. Central to our analysis is the concept of insurgent eco-spirituality, forms of resistance through which the Niños Santos intervene in ecological, spiritual, and political order, sustaining life while also withdrawing from damage and extractive relations. Withdrawal is the primary eco-spiritual modality we examine. The Niños Santos hide, they fall silent, or as people say, no te dejan entrar, which means they don't let you enter the spiritual world. See?
Who is responsible for the withdrawal of the Niños Santos? The answer is not simple. The withdrawal is a layered historical process, inseparable from the successive impacts of the modern war upon the Mazatec territory, a process that has reshaped not only human communities, but the Niños Santos themselves and the spiritual guardians of the territory. To speak of their withdrawal is to move beyond the visible and the self-evident, beyond fixed narratives. It compels us to go further back to pre-colonial memory, largely ignored and known outside Mazatec communities, to a time when communal life was rooted in natural time and in profound relationship with the sacred beings of the territory. When Robert Gordon Wasson arrived in the territory, the Mazatec territory, and later published his account of his participation in a mushroom ceremony in Life magazine in 1957, this marked a pivotal moment for understanding the changing circumstances surrounding the Niños Santos. Yet, these episodes cannot be separated from the longer history of colonization. They are a continuation of it, and the responsibility doesn't rest with Wasson alone, nor with the researchers and seekers who followed him. His presence was made possible by deeper structural forces. The global economic system that had been advancing in Mazatec territory since the late 19th century, imposing capitalist agriculture, accelerating rhythms of life, reconfiguring social hierarchies, and quickly fragmenting community organization. Both foreign capital and local mestizo landowners drove this process, extracting wealth from the land while displacing the subsistence practices that had sustained it. Alongside economic penetration came deliberate cultural pressure. Foreign interests pursued land exploitation, Castilianization, and scientific research on their own terms. In parallel, the Mexican state promoted indigenous policies aimed at incorporating indigenous peoples into the national fabric, replacing Mazatec language with Spanish, redirecting ceremonial relationship with the land toward productive agriculture, and gradually suppressing or marginalizing the veladas and the knowledge they carried. The goal, implicit and explicit, was to dissolve the biocultural distinctiveness of Mazatec life. The first blow to the Niños Santos was the deliberate invasion of their home, the sacred natural environment. Subsistent relationships with the land, relationships of reciprocity and care, were displaced by extractive practices oriented toward a production and the accumulation of wealth by foreign business people and some local people too. This was not a rupture that happened all at once. It advanced slowly, structurally, and it continues today in the form of psychedelic tourism market, the latest interaction of the same extractive logic that has always arrived in Mazatec territory wearing a new face. The Niños Santos have lived through all of this. They have witnessed every wave, colonization, extraction, acceleration, and now the global psychedelic market. And they have responded, not with silence born of absence, but with withdrawal born of judgment.
So now pictures a collector walking for hours through the Sierra Mazateca, climbing into the forest in search of the Niños Santos. This is no longer a short journey. What was once abundant now requires hours of searching. And sometimes at the end of that walk, what the collector finds is not Niños Santos, but the aftermath of their taking. Land struck by machetes, the herd torn open, the mushrooms already gone to markets. The image is where the ethics of the Niño Santo begin. Those who harvest for the market do not ask for permission, do not pray. They strike the herd with violence and take what they can sell. And the Niños Santos, collector tell us, do not forget. They do not sprout again when they have been taken this way. They do not come back, collectors say, and it hurts to lose them. What this means is that the Niños Santos hold us to account. Their healing forces does not unfold automatically. It must be earned through humility, forgiveness, and love. Without a solid spiritual life and the respect of moral and ethical rule, no relationship can be established. Without recognizing one's smallest before God, this is what the recollectors, the healers told us, there is no healing. No te dejan entrar. They do not let you enter the spiritual world. Those who approach with a hardened heart, corazón fuerte, experience nothing. Without the repair of ruptured relations with family, community, land, and divine beings, there is neither revelation nor healing. Contamination too closed the door. When lands, bodies, and soul are damaged, the Niños Santos withdraw. Efficacy is never mere biomedical or biochemical. It is relational and moral. even the gaze carries weight. Exposure of the mushroom to commercial eyes diminish their force. For this reason, the collectors we interviewed hide them, transport them secretly, circulate them only among those who knows how to receive them, never towards estafadores, the scammers, those who will sell what cannot be sold. At times, the collector, they do not even sell them. They just give them to those who desperately need them. Hence, the Niño Santo do not disappear just because of ecological crisis alone. They choose to withhold their presence in response to damaged, contaminated, and unethical relationships. This is where the moral and political dimension of withdrawal as resistance become visible. The mushroom cease to offer themselves when humility, commitment to forgive, repair, and care for oneself and the community no longer sustain the fragile relations among humans and land.
The withdrawal of the Niños Santos unfolds on their own terms, expressed in a language accessible only to those who have cultivated relations of respect with them. The earth in this world is not a backdrop. It's a living space, sensitive, vulnerable, and bound by spiritual, ethical, and moral laws. When those laws are violated, the Niños Santos withdraw. Their disappearance is their eco-spiritual insurgency against the accumulated historical violence and spiritual, moral, and ethical violation of the land. Mazatec testimonies evoke a past in which mushroom grew abundantly, and the tradition existed outside the dynamics of commercialization, outside of the capitalist time. These are not simple nostalgic narratives. They allow the Mazatec people to trace their own history, to articulate long-standing relationship with territory and with the spiritual entities that dwell within. The past invoked here serves a double purposes. It's a moral compass, distinguishing what is right within the tradition from what transgresses it, and a spiritual guide for navigating the presence. That present is shaped by the global psychedelic movement, which promises universal healing while subjecting the Niños Santos and the Mazatec people to pressures that demand they heal humanity without offering respect or reciprocity in return. Western science reduces their bodies and spirits to substances and objects, stripping them of spiritual and political agency. Commercial logics drive accelerated extraction to meet external demand, imposing the rhythms of capitalist time onto a tradition that demands patience, faith, and reverence for the sacred environment.
Conclude here. The Niños Santos refuse this. They choose not to appear when the relationship with humanity is shaped by extraction, acceleration, and broken relations. Their disappearance is an ethical consequence with ecological effect. This is where withdrawal becomes eco-spiritual insurgency. And this is where its moral and political dimensions become fully visible. The withdrawal of the Niños Santos is not a metaphor, but a judgment rendered by beings who have watched centuries of violation and have chosen on their own terms to withhold what is most sacred. What the Niños Santos are telling us is that there is no healing without accountability. There is no revelation without relation. So the question the Niños Santos leave us with is not whether psychedelics can heal the world, it's whether the world is capable of the humility and care that healing requires.
Mazatec accounts challenge contemporary psychedelic narratives that imagine mushrooms as universally accessible instruments of healing, insight, or planetary consciousness. At stake is an operation of abstraction, the violent separation of psychoactive substance from the moral, territorial, and eco-spiritual relation through which the Niños Santos teach, heal, reveal, and withdraw. For our part, as Mazatecs, we strive to live across different realities while confronting the challenges of modernity. We have never been passive, for against every attempt at domination, there will always arise resistance and air beings spiritual insurgency. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Adichin, thank you. Gracias. Can change my display. Oh, let's change my display settings. Okay. Well, this. Is, that. And next we have Dr. Stuart Sarbacker. Dr. Sarbacker is a visiting scholar at the CSWR this semester and a professor of comparative religion and Indian philosophy at Oregon State University. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you so much. I kind of am wishing I had gone first now. These are some just really, truly extraordinary presentations. I'm really humbled to be part of this panel. So what I'm going to be talking about today, riffing on the idea of the shadow, is different meanings of shadow, the way that in particular psychedelic exceptionalism and the search for a particular plant or a particular substance can actually cover up the real diversity of phenomenon on the ground level, as well as the way that a shadow can be constructive and maybe give cover or shields in such a way that it allows other cultures to flourish. And so I'm going to start, though, by talking just briefly about Soma, Gordon Wasson's work, which is sort of the introductory work for many people in thinking about psychoactives and psychedelics in Indic religion, spirituality, and yoga. His co-author, Wendy Doniger, wrote, "The history of the search for Soma is properly the history of Vedic studies in general of early Hinduism. And the Soma sacrifice was the focal point of the Vedic religion. Indeed, if one accepts the point of view that the whole of Indian mystical practice from the Upanishads to the more mechanical methods of yoga is merely an attempt to recapture the vision granted by the Soma plant, then the nature of that vision and of that plant underlies the whole of Indian religions, and everything of a mystical nature within that religion is pertinent to the identity of the plant." So they're really hyping this plant, right? Soma, and it's really captured the imagination of, I think, generations of people who have come to study Indian religion and think about psychoactives and psychedelics in that context. And of course, part of the reason is that There are verses in the Rig Veda that talk about drinking soma. I'm just going to read one of them. Appama somam amrita abhuma ganma jyotir avidama devan. We have drank soma, we've become immortal, amrita. We've gone to the light and we have met the gods. Or we implore you who make wide space for ardent exhilaration. To you belong the great songs of praise. For us, O drop, while seeking Indra, purify yourself in a stream of honey, like a rain-bearing cloud. O drop, you are cow-winning, man-winning, horse-winning, and prize-winning. You are the ancient embodiment of the sacrifice. That last point, I think, is exactly what Doniger was looking to, this idea that soma is the very essence of the sacrifice. But what I would argue is that we have a bit of confirmation bias going on with respect to Gordon Wasson's work. One way you could put it is, when all you have is a mushroom-shaped hammer, everything looks like a mushroom-shaped nail. And the fact is, and this is something I've been looking at extensively within my research, building upon the work of people like Falk, Jan Hubin, Matthew Clark, and others, is that it's actually quite much more likely that the original soma was in fact a Phaedra. And that as much as one might focus on the idea of it evoking a particular religious experience, the texts themselves talk about it more in terms of longevity, obtaining wealth in the form of cattle, which is quite interesting because, of course, the word capital means head and originally referred to the head of cattle, praja or offspring, and then last but not least, amrita or immortality. But you may see I've put an asterisk there because the priestly commentaries, when they analyze the term amrita, they interpret it to mean 100 years of life, a full human lifespan. So again, it perhaps suggests more longevity than it does some sort of spiritual state beyond the world. And so on the ground level, we can say that there's a lot of evidence, and I'm happy to discuss this more later, that ephedra is a better fit than either Amanita muscaria or some of the other options. But what's interesting about it is soma is not fixed. In fact, over time, it shifts in meaning, so that later the priestly commentaries say, well, there's the original ideal soma, but there are these other somas, and they are referred here by the names Putika, Adara, and Kusha, among other things, that could be used if you didn't have access to soma. Then, as time passes, we move into more of the classical era, early centuries of the Common Era. Suddenly, soma refers to both single and multiple plant formulas, what are called rasayanas, invigorants, which you find in both classical yoga and Ayurvedic texts. And so one of my favorite examples is in the Yoga Sutra Patanjali, perhaps the single most authoritative text of yoga. Patanjali says, he says in a verse, Janma Oshadi Mantra Tapaha Samadhi Jaha Siddhayaha, that siddhis, extraordinary modes of perception and action, arise out of 5 sources. They are achieved through birth. Some people are born with certain powers, herbs or herbal preparations, through mantras, through reciting mantras, through ascetic discipline or tapas, and samadhi or contemplation. And so here we see that herbs are being included within the locus of yogic practice, not as a substitute, but as an accessory or something to augment yogic practice. And they often take the form of a kalpa or preparation, and it can confer these siddhis, but in some texts, it's talked about more in terms of longevity. That if you are serious about your yoga practice, having a healthy body, having a long lifespan is important. So taking herbs for the sake of health can be a very constructive thing as well. In the post-classical period, especially in the medieval period, you see the emergence of multi-plant initiatory formulas that are for healing, but also for nootropic factors to enhance cognition, not so much to have a psychedelic journey, but to enhance meditative practice. And these are referred by a number of important names, including soma, but also amara or amrita, both meaning the nectar of immortality, dravya or substance, kalpa meaning preparation, gutika or vodka meaning pill, or churna, a powder, which in these Ayurvedic contexts in Tantra and in the medieval traditions of yoga called Hatha Yoga, serve again to achieve siddhis, extraordinary powers, but also longevity. And last but not least, it's worth mentioning, they're also used in magical, ceremonial contexts. In fact, one of the things as I've found as I've gone through these Sanskrit texts and manuscripts is just as often as not, psychoactive herbs are key elements of magical rituals that seek to, gain some sort of worldly power. Well, let's look at a few examples that I think will bring the sort of complexity of the picture here about. So this first set of readings comes from a very important yoga and tantric text from about the 10th century. So it says, you should drink 1,000 mantra consecrated brahmi, a plant called hyssop, or vacha, and you will undoubtedly quickly obtain great power of mentation. In other words, there's certain herbs, if you prepare them properly and consecrate them with mantras, they will enhance your intellectual functioning or mental abilities. The second example is a much more elaborate formula of the same thing. So one pala of white vacha, one karsha of turaga khandi, black pepper, turmeric, rock salt, gooseberry, and ginger. Having ground these together, one should combine them with ghee. The preparer should cook them in a mild fire in the juice of brahmi, this herb. This brahmi grita, or this brahmi oil described here, is then consecrated with 10,000 mantras. It says then that if you drink that at the moment of a solar eclipse, you become omniscient. And I think that's a really interesting example of set and setting, right? It's so much more powerful if you take it en masse at that moment of the solar eclipse, or you can let that butter harden and then you can lick it every morning. And it says, if someone who does that, presumably appealing to this idea of taking it through the tongue, one obtains eloquence of speech honored by assemblies of poets. And one thing you have to understand is a poet in this context was one of the most revered members of Indian civilization. And the ability to compose poetry, especially in the more sophisticated meters like danda, was considered almost a supernatural act. And in fact, I've read yogic texts that suggest that people, once they achieve spiritual liberation through yoga, they can either choose to enter into a kind of final state of liberation. They can fly around the earth while composing beautiful poetry in the danda meter. And so this plays into the idea that there's not just simply one substance which is being taken for one effect, but in fact, there's a whole set of different substances that are probably acting in a synergistic fashion to cultivate a particular type of experience. So here's one more, and this one really profoundly evokes the language of yoga here. By consuming the 5 nectars, here we have that word amara, the plancha or 5 amaras, he is immortal. He enjoys the powers of yoga, and I will explain those substances in your presence, O Supreme Lord. Indeed, without these, there is no achievement of perfection or siddhi, even in innumerable eons. There is indeed one immortal durva grass to be gathered in a knot, and another is cannabis or vijaya, also called Sarasvati, the goddess of speech, and the embodiment of perfection or siddhi. Another resides in the bilva leaf, producer of satisfaction in Shiva, and another for the purpose of yogic perfection is known as nirgundi or mara, and another, the black tulasi, the great pleaser of Sri Vishnu. These 5 notes should be known as the catalyst of yoga practice or sadhana. Of these, one should take twice the amount of the highest potency of Vijaya leaf, cannabis leaf, having worshiped women, women priests, women warriors, women merchants, and women laborers, and having gathered these substances together, one should eat this unexcelled powder. And presumably, again, we have all sorts of plant synergies going on here with vijaya or cannabis being the kind of central psychoactive agent that composes this. And so that pattern, which I've seen again and again through the yogic and tantric texts of this era, really point to the idea that there were these various formulations you could put together to enhance one's yogic practice, to gain certain siddhis or supernormal abilities of speech, of sight, of hearing, etc., rather than one thing, one plant that's doing one thing. And last but not least, it's worth mentioning that in contemporary India, cannabis use among sadhus or renouncers is incredibly widespread. But even among them, there's very profoundly different ideas about how you use cannabis, whether it's just more or less a social lubricant that you use when you're with friends or with your associates, whether it's something that you use as a more sacramental kind of process to enter into deep states of devotional reverie, or whether you use it to practice meditation or to affect the energetic movements of the body. So there's a wide spectrum of uses even among cannabis itself. So that's really the first part of my paper and project here, which is talking about how getting beyond this sort of mushroom exceptionalism to talking about really the complex range of both substances and uses associated with the practice of yoga. The other part, though, that I really want to spend the rest of my talk on, though, is talking more about specifically the psychedelic renaissance and really the shadow cast by the therapeutic model that in some respects both perhaps obscures some of the elements of psychedelic use, but also to some extent provides a kind of cover and allows for certain types of psychedelic practices to happen because it profoundly changes public discourse as well as, in some cases, legal regulation. And so one thing worth mentioning, though, to start is that Roland Griffiths, who's obviously a critical figure in the psychedelic renaissance, himself was a practitioner of a tradition called siddha yoga. And he acknowledged on several occasions towards the end of his life that his motivation to pursue psychedelic research came out of experiences that he had while meditating in the siddha yoga tradition. So one could say there's a very direct relationship between experiences in the practice of yoga and his taking up this charge. Now, it's interesting to note the guru of the tradition he was in, Chitvalasananda, was a disciple of Muktananda, who I believe had a lot of influence on Christina and Stan Grof earlier on. So there's a kind of parallel history, I think, of influence of these modern meditative yoga traditions upon the psychedelic counterculture. But I want to really get at 2 points. One is that as someone who's gone through psychedelic facilitator training in Oregon, I can tell you that this idea articulated here by Janice Phelps as proficiency in complementary techniques as a kind of toolbox a facilitator should have is very much intimately tied up with the theory and practice of yoga, and in particular, the development of different techniques of breath control. And even one might argue that this spiritual and transpersonal intelligence aspect is very deeply influenced by Indian religion and philosophy. And again, we might track it to some of our, the prime suspects like Aldous Huxley and Leary's, Metzner's and Alpert's psychedelic experience, which drew very deeply on Tibetan yoga traditions. You also have, as the bottom right example indicates, psychedelic training programs that very explicitly weave yoga teacher training into it. And so there's a kind of plugging in of the yoga community. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at training programs and seen, 75% of the facilitators are registered yoga teachers. And not only that, one of my suspicions too in doing the Oregon program was that the modular nature of the psychedelic facilitator training programs was actually being drawn from the 200-hour yoga alliance training model, this idea that you could build, through these building blocks of different modes of practice, put together a program that provided a coherent curriculum for a larger population. In some respects, one might criticize that model as one criticizes the 200-hour yoga model. 200 hours is not a lot of practice, to step in and start really working with other people in a serious way. But nonetheless, it is at least some basic standard. And of course, in Oregon, the reason they kept the bar so low was because they did not want a two-tiered system, even though ultimately that's what happened, because really the cost of doing work through a formal service center is not very cost effective. And so it's, I think, precluded a lot of people from entering into that. But the sort of final argument I want to make here is that one of the things that the therapeutic environment has done is really opened the door for things like psychedelic churches or organizations like the Psychedelic Sangha, who are integrating psychedelics with yoga practice or with Buddhist practice. Actually, Lotus Find Journeys is another example of integrating yoga into a Buddhist context, that in some cases, the legal regime has changed, but also public opinion. And one example I'd like to give is in Oregon. I was talking to a colleague about ayahuasca communities. And I said, oh, isn't there one down in Eugene, Oregon, like an hour away from us? He's like, Stuart, there's one here in Corvallis. And I had initially thought, when psilocybin becomes legal, all these people are going to be having psychedelic experiences. We're going to have this big kind of, psychedelic renaissance, great awakening 2.0. But I think what's really happened is that people have realized that I can go through training and it doesn't make sense for me to do above ground work because it's not cost effective. I can't do it in my home, etc. So people are gravitating towards psychedelic churches. And the more permissive atmosphere of legal psilocybin, I think, has really made that possible. And so you get all sorts of interesting kind of different permutations of this happening. You no longer have to go to Costa Rica or Peru. You can go to Eugene, or Corvallis and have a session with a community. Well, last but not least, I think there's an interesting point or connection to be drawn between not only the kind of religious experience-oriented kinds of practices, but the ways in which microdosing, the use of nootropics, certain aspects of transhumanist thought are all intersecting with the practice of yoga in our historical moment. And some of it echoes the plurality of uses of herbs within the Indic context. Some people are looking to induce a kind of psychedelic experience. Others are looking for something nootropic. Others are more concerned for health and well-being. One of the practitioners at the Pacific Northwest Integrative Center that does microdosing expressed it to me as something like, you come in and do like a breath work or a meditation practice, and you take that microdose, and maybe you have a little bit deeper experience of mindfulness, or you have a little bit deeper experience of that breath control or pranayama. And as a result, when you go home, your practice is transformed. The idea is you don't have to keep coming back, that sometimes it's enough to give you a sense of something special happening in your practice that then you can cultivate on your own, which is so much in line with the ways in which communities, say in the post-60s counterculture, gravitated towards yoga, gravitated towards Buddhism as a way to integrate their experience, and in some cases try to evoke or sustain the kinds of experiences that they had without, when they no longer had access to the sort of psychedelic resources. And so on that note, I'm going to finish up. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stuart. Got about 30 minutes for discussion and Q&A. Let's see here. All right. Okay, I have about 7 questions. I will not ask them all. I may not even ask any of them. Let's see. Okay, something that brought a lot of your papers together was sort of are we living in Wasson's world? It feels in many ways that we are living in Wasson's world. I'm curious I don't know if you have any reflections on that or connections that you might have made between each other's arguments as saying, oh, okay, Soma is appearing here, and how we're understanding, the Vedic tradition's connection to psychedelics, or how South America and specifically the Sierra Mazateca was folded into the psychedelic umbrella, or how Wasson offers a particular sort of iteration of psychedelicism. Any play across the papers in Wasson's world in which we may be finding ourselves in. And I don't know if, Marlena, if Wasson came up among the urban indigenous interlocutors you had.
Okay, there we go. Coincidentally, I actually spent a few hours in the Wasson archives this morning viewing the Maria Sabina collection. And my introduction, well, I think Wasson, it was a very surreal, powerful experience to be able to sit there with her images and to listen to her sing. Very emotional, extremely powerful, and almost felt forbidden. Almost felt like I shouldn't be listening to this, just because the culture that I come from, you're not allowed to record ceremony, and you don't record those things because they become trapped and they become prisoners within the media that they're captured. And so to live in Wasson's world, I don't want to live in Wasson's world.
Perhaps another way to ask this question is, how do we get out of Wasson's world? What are the escape hatches?
Just one note. If you hang around psychedelic conferences long enough, you hear people say that Gordon Wasson was a VP at JP Morgan Chase Bank. And you all know that's not true, right? He was VP of marketing at JP Morgan Bank. And so in a lot of ways, we're living in the marketer's world. And it's not so surprising. And so it really is, I think, a contest of narratives. And I think this panel is such a fantastic intervention. Paul, you want to know the one thing that came up across all of us? It's attempts to stage interventions to open up a space where other voices can be heard, not capturing the flag, but really saying, hey, look, we have this variety. And I think it's particularly interesting when there isn't necessarily apparent continuity between the varieties. I mean, Ramsey, you have a line to understand human diversity diversely. That to me is the whole point. That rings true to me. So I just want to say a personal thank you to everyone on the panel for coming out for that.
Yeah. What is interesting to me is that sometimes we tend to focus on Wasson, but for me, it's more interesting to see a little bit, as you say, right, what Wasson represent, because he had a lot of people around him that allowed him to do what he did. He was not the first person to go to Huautla to see Maria Sabina. There were many Mexican, there was Roque, the Mexican psychiatrist who was working with Maria Sabina, but he never did what Wasson did. And, Wasson was not just Wasson. Wasson was the biomedical world, searching the scientific words, exploring. It was the long hand of imperialism and extractivism. This is what Wasson was, and it was not one single person. And this is what Osiris said, right? It's Wasson, it is all the people who came after him that can even lead us to the Wasson archive and to the image of Huautla that are here and not in Huautla. This is what wasn't is. So wasn't is a word that means many things.
I think that we give a lot of attention to the image of Gordon Wasson, but what happened with another realities and another alterities from the Mazatec people, for example? Because yeah, I agree, Wasson is just a part of this long historical process. You know, I see the psychedelic movement like a long historical process, unfinished process. Gordon Wasson is just a part of this process. And yeah, what represents this image of this person is not a person, part of a historical process too. If you see a photograph of Gordon Wasson, the person of Gordon Wasson, what happened behind him in his history, in the history of his society, in the Western society that was living in that moment? What happened in that moment? It's not just Wasson. It's part of a big puzzle. And now us are part of another piece of this big puzzle. We don't have the full picture. We have just a small thing. And maybe in 15 years, we have another part of this big puzzle, but maybe some of us pass it away in that moment. You know, this is the history. This is part of the historical analysis. But that's it. Thank you.
One thing I was thinking a bit about was Christian gave a paper a couple of years ago, was talking about different generations of scholarship around psychedelics. And, you know, one of the things I have been so happy about being part of the CSWR here is it really seems like a place where I can talk about psychedelics in this work in a serious way and do serious academic work. And at the same time, there's a kind of a public facing quality to it. And at times I feel like public psychedelic discourse is kind of dominated by people who don't have an academic grounding, who have not done their homework and rely on people like Wasson when they're formulating their opinions. And so I think it's sort of symptomatic of a larger thing in the academic world where I really believe, you know, one of the ways forward for the humanities is to really recognize the import and value of speaking out of the university to other communities, but finding a way to do that in a nuanced way that avoids the kind of, you know, search for one thing or one theory to fit them all or whatever. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.